Good morning and welcome. I'm Rebecca Van Dyke, an OLLI volunteer, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's program. Remember that WCC has hearing amplification devices. Raise your hand if you need one. This is the first in the 3 summer lectures. Up front, I want to acknowledge the OLLI volunteers who developed this lecture series. They are Jerry Gardner, Will Hawk, Betty Michael, Marie Vitale, Catherine Wu, and co-chairs Carol Levin and Al Paz. Today's lecture is Why Do I Like This Place? Creating Great Urban Spaces by Eileen and Norm Tyler. Remember, our program is hybrid. We'll have 2 audiences, all of you in front of me here at the Towsley Auditorium, and those logged in on a Zoom webinar. The presentation will be the same for both. During the Q&A, we'll alternate questions between the 2 audiences. We'll have a mic handler, Bob, who will take the written questions from those of you in the WCC auditorium. Remember that the main issue for you Zoom audience is to know about the Q&A icon. To submit a question, just click on the Q&A icon at the center bottom of your viewing window. There's also a chat icon. Do not use the chat for questions. That's only for technical difficulty. There's a closed caption icon also at the bottom of your viewing window if you wish to use it. I'd like to call your attention to a future event, an OLLI out-of-town experience, experiencing, exploring, and enjoying Detroit's Belle Isle. This will be July 14th in person. Now to today's program. The legal disclaimer: the views expressed during the lecture and the Q&A do not necessarily reflect those of the university and OLLI. As you know, we'll have a 1-hour presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. I will now introduce our speakers. Eileen Tyler is an architect and advocate for the built environment. She worked for over 30 years at Quinn Evans Architects as their Director of Historic Preservation. Her projects included restoration of the Nashville Parthenon. I'd love to see that. The old courthouse in St. Louis and the Detroit Observatory in Ann Arbor. For many years, she taught a course in preservation technology at Eastern Michigan University. Norm Tyler taught at Eastern Michigan University for 26 years and served as its Director of Urban and Regional Planning Program Director from 1990 to 2009. He received his architecture doctorate from the University of Michigan and a PhD from Michigan State. In 2012, he was honored to become a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of certified planners. Norm and Eileen co-authored the successful book, Historic Preservation, An Introduction to its History, Principles, and Practice, now in its 3rd edition. They live in their historic Greek Revival house in downtown Ann Arbor. Both have been community activists for over half a century, and each has served on the boards of numerous community and professional organizations. Please welcome Eileen and Norm Tyler.
Thank you.
Okay, you go on the other side.
Sound check?
Sound check. Ooh. I guess. Okay. So we've titled our talk, Why Do I Like This Place? And what we wanted to understand better for ourselves and hopefully share with you is that creating great urban spaces is not a given. It's not automatic. It doesn't happen with a lot of thought and care. And we thought we'd share a little bit of the perception of what makes them great. What we also wanted to make sure we explained that it is our personal view of the elements of a better way in Ann Arbor. And so for this, we asked ourselves 2 questions. What are the places that we care about, and what can be learned from other places around the world? So it's a mix and interjected images to help you get at the answer that might be for that question. This is not there's also a disclaimer that this is not a presentation of any positions or policies or plans of the city, but it is our own, hopefully inspired presentation for your edification, enjoyment. Thank you. Okay.
We want to begin with a statement from architect Bernard Hunt, who once said, "We are good at putting up buildings, but we are very bad at making places." And that's why we wanted to talk today not about buildings so much, but about the places that result from those buildings' placements. We are good at putting up buildings, but we are bad at making places. I want to begin by, we were making some references to other sources before we get to Ann Arbor. One of the best sources I've used in my teaching was a book by Edmund Bacon, who actually is the father of Kevin Bacon, the architect actor, but he was also the planning director for Philadelphia for many years, and he wanted to have a new plan for the city of Philadelphia's downtown, and he wrote this book as a way to convince his planning commissioners to adopt some larger goals and visions for downtown Philadelphia. So it was a very successful book that way, and one that I used in my class many times. And I'm going to use one example from the book, and that is the city of Venice, before we get to Ann Arbor, because it is an example of a city that developed over 1,000 years. It was very irregular in its plan, asymmetrical, highly varied, and yet it works beautifully as an urban environment. Why? One of the major reasons is because it had a heart. It had a space that they created during this time as part of the organic plan, Piazza San Marco. And if we look at pictures of Piazza San Marco, we see that the cathedral was a primary role, and they wanted to put a space in front of that, but they were sophisticated enough to realize that that space had to be someplace special. And so they didn't put a typical rectangular space in front, they made it trapezoidal so that you would see the building on a bit of a 3-dimensional axis. You would see it on an angle, and actually it would be an expanded space. So it was very sophisticated in its planning. And then they also wanted to make the plaza continue in an L shape down to the water side, because water is a very important part of Venice. And they used the Campanile as a kind of a pivot point to make that work, as we see the Campanile at the intersection of those 2 plazas. Interestingly, in 1902, that Campanile collapsed. It wasn't well built, but they described the time the wound of the Colossus opened up. The side facing San Marco split apart, the crowds let out a long cry, and still bursting sound could be heard. And yet the people of Venice decided immediately that they would rebuild it just as it was, because it was so important to the plan. And so as we look at the Piazza San Marco now, we see it going to the water. They've established 2 columns there. Those 2 columns then would be an entrance to the piazza and also be a way to have walkways along the water. This is a very sophisticated plan from Venice that we can draw many kind of conclusions from.
So I only interject this slide to ask you, to what lengths and to what expenses should we go to preserve the places we care about? Well, Venice is just this outside image, and it's such a beloved site for, how many of you have been to Venice? Oh my goodness, wow, okay.
So you appreciate
Well,
it.
you know, how many of you have been to it when it has flooded? Oh my goodness. So to what lengths are they going to go to preserve this? Because this is such a universal love affair with Venice and what it means to so many people all over the world. So they built this system that is shortcut named MOSE. It took decades to finish. It is done. They've tested run it a few times, and it does work to keep the water levels under control. For now, they don't see it, obviously, as for the forever, but that was the purpose. Is this thing is outsized in importance, and so to what lengths and to what expense will you go in trying to keep a place that is so meaningful to you? That's an example, global, okay.
So we talked about Edmund Bacon and his approach to planning, and we'll come back to him in a little later in the presentation, but I want to introduce you to one other planner, Christopher Alexander, who wrote many books on planning, including A New Theory of Urban Design. And I'm taking a quote directly from that book. "The venerable cities of the past convey a feeling of wholeness." And that's going to be the key of our talk today, this sense of wholeness of city plans. An organic unity that surfaces in every detail, large and small. But this sense of wholeness is lacking in modern urban design. Indeed, architects, absorbed in problems of individual structures, architects worry about individual structures, city planners are preoccupied with local ordinances, and it's almost impossible then to achieve true wholeness in a plan. And this is where we're going as we look at Ann Arbor. We're going to look at the history of Ann Arbor in different sections, and we're going to look at it because Ann Arbor does not take a wholeness approach to its planning. What it does is gives approval to plans one parcel at a time. A developer comes in and says, I want to do housing on this site, I want to do an office building, I want to do a store on this site, and the city responds to that. And so it's done a piecemeal kind of approach, and Ann Arbor has largely been planned by developers rather than the city, who sort of has to, by right, approve these things. So we're going to look at it and see if we can take a more wholeness approach to it. And we're going to look at it in 3 sections, 3 districts of the city. First along the river, next around Carytown, and finally around the downtown.
So the development of Ann Arbor, many of you probably know, may know more than I do, but it started, of course, along the river. And the pre-existing the white settlement, we had the Native American community populations that occupied and traversed through it using these known by historic research where those paths are. And you can see that even then, Washtenaw County was a hub of activity, lots of migration through the space by those people. Then in 1807, the Treaty of Detroit ceded the land by the Native communities of the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Wyandot Native American nations to the U.S. government. They turned over their rights to occupy it as they had traditionally, and while they retained some rights to occupy their village land and hunt on the land, most of them moved out of the area after 1807. The unsettled area was still relatively inhospitable to early settlers. It was rather swampy and had a lot of poor soil, at least that was a perception. But then there were these 2 guys, John Allen and Elisha Rumney. So John Allen comes to Rumsey, I would say Rumney. John Allen was in doubt when he left his family in Virginia and came to Detroit, thinking, okay, something's about to break loose. He was joined, or at the same time, Elisha Rumsey also arrived, but he came from New York. At the same time, the 2 men met in Detroit and said they each wanted to create a business partnership and a new life in Michigan. So they staked out this claim on the Huron River west of Detroit to begin this venture in 1824. The river, as John Allen was quoted, is the most beautiful I have beheld and abounding with the most valuable fish. So they knew they needed the river for transportation, food, drink, and power, and it would nurture their fledgling enterprise. The Erie Canal was finished in the year later, 1 year later. So all of a sudden, instead of overland routes or individual boat transfers across this land and across the lakes, people were coming in larger groups and could bring their animals and their goods across the upper New York, and bypassing Niagara Falls, it was a much easier route to get to the Midwest. So that was, again, 1825, so still before the established a formal population in Ann Arbor. But 1824 is officially the bicentennial, or yeah, 2024. Anson Brown came just a few years later in 1827, and he was very ambitious as well, but he decided, well, he was going to have to develop the north side of the river. He built this amazing commercial building, this very substantial, and it is the oldest commercial building still in existence in Ann Arbor today. He named all the streets after streets in New York, but sadly, he died young. He didn't get to fulfill his dream. He died of cholera, and his premature death resulted in a lot of the power shifting to the south side of the river, and Lower Town suffered in a sort of decline after that. It didn't get the intense advocacy for building it up as equal to the Ann Arbor on the south side of the river. The building itself has been restored. Jim Coley owns the Northside Grill, and he acquired the building about 20 years ago and has made it habitable on the upper floors with commercial businesses on the ground floor. That is still the way it is today, so it's kind of treading water. During this time, they felt, the city people on the south side felt they should establish a mill race along the river to capture power for processing the grain and the wood that was mostly harvested from the north side or the surrounding area. This led to, again, the further division of the north side being more agricultural and farmland, and the south side being developed with all the parcels of land in the early plat maps. The mills were built on this stretch in the late 1900s, but they were destroyed by fire in the early 1900s, and they were not rebuilt because this mill function and industrial processing was more efficiently carried out in the states farther west of Michigan. So what happens to that land? The mills aren't rebuilt. They said, well, it's kind of an industrial site. We'll put the gas plant there. And the problem with the gas plant, of course, is that it burned coal, and the coal waste was left on site. So this, for decades, the bend in the river was really a polluted eyesore and a hollowed out middle of what we would have hoped could be the center of enjoyment for the town. Couldn't we do anything better with our river? Well, you know what, 70, 80 years ago, that was kind of a dead end. So some people have often thought, why couldn't we have something like San Antonio? They just love their river. And if how many have been on the riverboat tours in San Antonio? It's just such a delight. I've done it twice because every time I go to San Antonio, only twice, I have loved seeing that eye-level view with the water of all the activity that thrives. It still struggles as a downtown, but the river is considered an important asset. And then if you're lucky enough to be there during a festival, it goes crazy. And one of the times we were there, we were there during a festival. Everyone's dressed up, and they have so it's just vital activity on the river. So what that has done is it's a circuitous route. All this is happening around the downtown, and things are connected by the water. It's not like, I think even people run their own little boats like taxis. But really, we needed to think differently for Ann Arbor, more realistically.
So let's come back to Ann Arbor then, and we'll look at the river here. The Barton Dam is part of it. Argo Dam, excuse me, not Barton. Let me pull this out here so I can point to a couple things. The dam is right here, And in 1920s, the firm of Frederick Law Olmsted, the Olmsted Brothers, the firm that designed Central Park, did plans all over the country in different cities, came up with the idea of things to do along the west bank of the river, Glen Avenue, another part of town, but they also suggested that along the river, the dam could be used as a walkway that would connect one side of the river to the other side. It could go under the railroad tracks and end up on Main Street and Depot Street. 100 years ago, this was an idea that sort of connected a walkway across the entire city. So as we look at that from the Olmsted plan, finally, a few years ago, Beck and Rader planning firm in Ann Arbor here came up with an idea for using that mill race where we had the mills and the sawmills and the flour mills, converting it from above the dam down below the dam and making a cascades out of it as a recreational area. And as we know now, the Argo Dam cascades have been very successful. Any particular day in the summer, you're going to see tons of people there. You'll see on the left picture somebody with a V, that's me and my white hair, one of the few older people on the cascades, but we love being there. We take our family there all the time.
Yeah. How many have done the Cascades? See, you're never too old.
You're never too old, do it, it's fun.
Yeah, it's fun.
And so we look at not only at the cascades, but now we see the walkway being developed too, not only for runners and walkers, but part of this whole system of the cascades and whatever. And so we now start to see the river in a different light, because as we look at the city, we still are starting to use the river in new ways, but we still have this site that's there sitting now vacant and polluted. What are we going to do with that? And so the view from Broadway Bridge shows us what was referred to as a DTE site. Now we can refer to it as a Broadway Park West, because a plan has been approved and begun for development of that area into, I think, a very significant redevelopment for the city along the river. And it makes the river a whole new kind of wholesome area. If we go back to that wholeness kind of theme, the river is now a great community resource. The small picture on the left, you'll see a bridge that crosses the river directly from the Broadway West development over to the park. The other side of the river, buildings toward the river, also buildings set back from the river with walkways, steps right down to the river. A very interesting plan to move forward with.
But almost every city that amounted to anything had to have a rail line, and Ann Arbor was no different. In fact, we had two rail lines, Ann Arbor Railroad and Michigan Central. And when Michigan Central first came into the area, they built a simple station along the tracks very close to, almost maybe exactly where the Amtrak station is today. And that began to build or solidify the way both industrial goods and people were coming into the city. That showed that it was going to be important, but they quickly outgrew that station and wanted something more substantial, more as a better arrival location, and Michigan Central Depot was constructed. And for 80 years or so, then that was the major point of arrival and departure for many people, whether going off to war or coming to school, university. But what's interesting is when it's been 70 years since the Gandhi Dancer has been in the station. And when Chuck Muir purchased it, Amtrak didn't want it. It was too much for them. They weren't going to restore it.
Not 70 years, it's 1970.
1970, well,
That'd be 50 years.
50 plus two decades now.
Okay.
That's 70. But
It's 30 plus 20 is what it is, it's 50. I can do the math.
oh yeah, okay. Yeah, anyway, it is older than you think as a restaurant. I was surprised that it went back to 1970. We graduated from college in 1970, so it wasn't there then. But we go there now and then, and the delight of anybody who goes there for dinner is getting that table right on the windows and waiting for the train to come by. You never know, you forget about it. And then all of a sudden the train goes by, and everybody in the restaurant applauds. It's just a really wonderful Ann Arbor moment. And that happened to us a few years ago on Mother's Day, and that's been our memory, and the excitement of that still retained in as your experience of, anybody else been there when the train goes by? Oh my goodness, you guys are Ann Arborites. Absolutely. So that has continued, and it has kept the building viable and important, but the we've outgrown the Amtrak station. That's the biggest problem, and it's been a real impediment to what happens along the tracks. And so the Fuller Street project or proposal has failed, and yet we still need a new station for Amtrak. And so the goal is to consider, well, where could it go? If it's too small a site to put it where the Amtrak station is now, could we maybe think about the parkland across from the Candy Dancer, which already has a road that goes down to the parking, so you could have, we didn't overplan it, but we tried to think, how do we keep it downtown? Because our view is that this area needs the train station in this location somewhere and not out by the hospital. You can,
So if we look at the wholeness of the riverfront area before we go to the next one, we will see then we've got the, on the left side of the slide, the walkway that connects to Fifth Avenue. We've got the new development. And on the right side, we see the suggestion of maybe that's a location for a new train station. It's easy to get to. It certainly relates. Maybe there are some ideas there that will tie and make this whole solution part of it. We next go to the Carytown area from there, and if we go back to our diagram, we'll see that the green line follows across the dam. It actually goes under the railroad tracks. This is a new city walkway, which works beautifully. We're on it all the time ourselves. And a big ramp that goes up and exits on Fifth Avenue. And so as you come off of this new walkway area from the river, you're on Fifth Avenue coming right directly into Carytown with bikeways and walkways. And it becomes the possibility of an interesting walkway. If we look at Carytown then, in modern times, we know what it looks like. But we want to look historically at it because Carytown begins with the Lewick Brothers Lumber Company, which is in the building that is now part of Carytown. And it was used as a lumber company from 1873 to 1930, but in 1931 that land was given to the city for a market. And in 1942 the building was purchased for the Washtenaw Farm Bureau store, and it started to change its character. Behind that building was another building, the former Godfrey Moving and Storage Building that was built in 1899, still an old building. And you may remember when it was the Workbench Furniture Building, which was a big furniture store that we bought some furniture from back in the 70s as well. If you look at those two buildings then, you can see the nature of what became the Carytown Shops and Market as part of it. And we have to give a lot of credit to that to contractor Joe O'Neill, because he took over those two buildings and created what we have now, added the tower, the bells that you can go in, and bells that he imported from overseas that you can go in and play yourself at some time. If you haven't done that, certainly do that. And we appreciate that Joe O'Neill had a sense of how to create a place in Carytown that went beyond just the normal. And you can see some of the other projects that he's been involved with on the list there. He has been a very active kind of contributor to the development of Ann Arbor in so many ways. We appreciate Joe for what he's
one
done.
of my favorite buildings working on with Joe O'Neill as an architect was the restoration of, now I'm going to do the blank on it, on 3rd and William, where his offices are.
Oh, the Argus building.
The Argus building where they were making the cameras. And that was a vision in his mind of how he could restore it and make it commercially viable. He was a delight to work with, and he stayed true to what he was trying to accomplish. So I always enjoyed working with Joe.
So we look now at the market and shops, but we also want to look at the farmers market where we sell our goods. And that was, in 1919, the farmers market was established actually at Courthouse Square, where the old county courthouse used to be. Along Fifth Avenue, it gradually expanded to Ann Street. And the food was brought in by horse and wagon, and it grew and expanded around the corner. And it became a very popular spot. But in 1931 then, the land became available at the old Lewick's Lumber Building, and the farmers market was reestablished there. And the roof structure then was part of the Works Progress Administration under Roosevelt and was completed in 1941, and that became the market that we know of today. So the two things are so closely linked, the market and the Carytown Shops. And the activities there happen every Saturday and round. We have the farmers market every Saturday around and twice a week in the summer. And we also have the Book Fest. We contributed, you see a picture on the left, there we are at the Book Fest selling some of our books, which are out in the lobby if you want to look at them. And the Artisans Market on Sundays, and many other activities. The Kindle Fest is an annual holiday tradition at the market. The Farmers Market hosts artisans, entertainers celebrating the holiday. It is a very active place. And in fact, if we want to make a comparison, we have been to Seattle a number of times. We'll ask you once again, who's been to Pike Place Market in Seattle? Because more than half of the people here have raised their hands. This is the place we always go to when we go out to Seattle. It is established first in 1907. They now have it as a historic ordinance district where you can't change it. It has to stay old, which I think is very interesting. You can't even change the timbers or the roofing. You can update it, you can maintain it, but you can't change anything because they want to keep the value of this as a public space. And so the market's charter preserves the buildings for the future. And as we see that, as a result, Pike Place Market has become the soul of Seattle to its residents. This is where they go to shop, this is where they go to hang out. This is largely their town center, if we want to think of it that way, built around that.
And Zingerman's is as a component of Carytown that you might not think of at first because we've been talking so much about the Carytown buildings and the farmers market. But Zingerman's is just around the corner, and we feel it's a very essential part of the district. It was originally Dyroff's Market, a grocery store that had also been known as Desdorides, funny names, or the marketplace. But the owner of this business did not flourish under his ownership. And so it sort of struggled along as a component of the area, but it was not a successful, exciting destination that Zingerman started in 1982 when R.A. Weinswag and Paul Saginaw bought the building and said, well, let's just put a deli in there. But quickly they needed to make the improvements that included barrier-free access and offered some space that became really an urban space of outdoor seating. So that was in their vision right from the beginning. And for many years, that was the heart of the community of businesses that is Zingerman's and has expanded elsewhere around the city. But that building essentially keeps the character of when it was Dyroff's and is still like that today. It is the biggest draw to Ann Arbor, to Carytown, I shouldn't say to Ann Arbor, to Carytown, the neighborhood. Everyone wants to do both. People can order online today, or you can come in and there's a little cubby building where you can order when you're on site and then wait in the extensive outdoor seating, or you can come inside and just buy fresh bread or deli materials, and that's usually what we do because we don't want to wait for sandwiches. We
don't have to ask how many people have been to Zingerman's because I know the answer to that one.
Yeah. But in many parts of the year, and especially during COVID, the outdoor seating was really welcome. They added a comfort of some heat and tents. But it's definitely a gathering place. People who come to visit, they all want to say, can we go to Zingerman's? Or where's Zingerman's from here? And so we are always taking our family and outdoor visitors from other places. On the other side of Carytown is Braun Court. We think that that is an integral part of the Carytown experience. And it was built originally as affordable housing after the war, World War II, but it has changed character over the decades since then. And most recently, the Kevin Orr and Martin Contreras established this as a node for the LGBTQ community. And the excitement of being allowed to marry someone of yours, like you, a gender, was celebrated magically at Braun Court. I had to go over and see it because there was a lot of excitement. And so there's they don't
see you pointing.
No, you don't see me. Okay, there's the little place, I can't see it exactly, but somewhere over there is where they had the trellis set up for the wedding, and they performed the ceremony, and the news cameras were there. Whoopsie. There's a news camera, and it was just given a lot of celebratory awareness to a feature of Carytown. We don't know what's going to happen next with the area, with the changes.
But the story of Carytown, of course, as successful as it's been, and as much as we enjoy that area, we have to realize that there's another part to that story, and that is the impact of all of this on the African American neighborhood. This used to be the African American neighborhood. They couldn't live anywhere else in Ann Arbor, so most of the African Americans in town, as the population grew during the war, between the wars, ended up in this 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue neighborhood. In 1960s, 4th Avenue was the center of this black neighborhood. It had businesses, it had churches, it had Jones School, which is now Community High School. That was the school for all of the kids in the neighborhood. And the Dunbar Community Center, which was actually used by the African American kids, but also white kids who were in the area. But then the federal government, in its decision to improve the neighborhood, came along with the Model Cities program, which made the properties more valuable, which meant that the whites were attracted there and the blacks had to rely more on moving to places that were more affordable or into public housing. And so it lost its character as an African American neighborhood. And as we see in this 1986 article in the Ann Arbor News, the city's black neighborhoods are disappearing. As a result, many black families moved into public housing and whatever. So part of Carytown and what we propose is that shouldn't be forgotten completely. We need to have some recognition of the cultural heritage that is part of the African American culture in Ann Arbor as well. They do have the African American Festival. It now takes place on 4th Avenue and Ann Street. It happened last weekend. We went over and saw it. Lots of music, lots of booths, whatever, as an attempt to try to keep that culture alive. There are tours of the Underground Railroad sites around town, including this one house that's down on 5th Avenue. And while we're taking photos in this area, we ran across 2 people that were doing a tour of the African American sites, Scott McFadden and Deb Meadows. And I did talk to other African Americans because I was trying to figure out if we wanted to reestablish the African American kind of culture in a way that recognized its history, who could we use as a sort of significant historical figure for that? And a name that kept coming up that I wasn't familiar with too much was the one of Reverend C.W. Carpenter, who I want to explain a little bit about him because he was a very significant historical figure for us in Ann Arbor. He studied with George Washington Carver. He worked for Booker T. Washington. He was valedictorian at Tuskegee's graduating class, so he had a lot of credentials even as he was getting trained. And when he came to Ann Arbor, he was pastor of the Second Baptist Church in Ann Arbor for 37 years, very influential with the African American neighborhood, but also with the entire city. He became part of the president of the Ann Arbor Ministerial Association. He worked with Ann Arbor Human Relations Commission, the Citizens Advisory Committee for a Workable Program, Ann Arbor Bus, and he helped integrate the Ann Arbor Kiwanis. Carpenter was, I want to read this, Carpenter was a beloved figure in the Ann Arbor community. He was known for his wisdom, compassion, and his commitment to social justice. He was a tireless advocate for the poor and the disadvantaged. Reverend Carpenter died in 1970 at the age of 83. He was a giant of the civil rights movement and a true champion of social justice. Many of us don't know much about Mr. Carpenter, Reverend Carpenter, but I think we should. And to the point where we would like to have some recognition of him in this neighborhood. And one of the ideas we had was, what about that field that's behind the community high school? That field is used by students. It has a basketball court, but it's largely unused. It's a big open space, and we're wondering maybe we could establish that as part of this wholeness approach to Carytown, and in fact give recognition to it as the Carpenter Culture Park. This is totally our own idea. It comes from nowhere other than from the 2 of us, so don't hold it against anybody else. But this prime location in Carytown could be planned for many community events. It could be a place for the high school events to happen because it is public school property. It could have local musicians and a stage, and in fact, the community high is known for its jazz band, and so they could have many performances there. The festival could be located there. You could expand the food and plant sales at Carytown, seasonal activities, and heritage celebrations. So as we look then at this community high school open field, one of the ideas we had was there's been some discussion about what to do with the band shell at West Park because it's not being used and it should be moved somewhere else. Russ Collins has been talking about that for a long time from the Michigan Theater. We could move that band shell to this park, maybe put a fountain there. We haven't really designed a park, but this is a possibility. This is a chance to bring something to that area of town that might be very valuable. So as we look at the wholeness district of Carytown, we start over on the left with Brown Court, but there's also new housing, affordable housing going on Catherine Street down there at the corner. We have a new condo building going on that triangular lot across from the farmer's market. And then if we established a culture park, maybe even renaming the high school not as Community High, but as Jones High School to give more recognition. And of course we have Zingerman's. This becomes a very kind of sense of what Christopher Alexander was talking about when he talks about wholeness. It brings wholeness to the Carytown area as well.
So we also wanted to ask how other places take on special meaning, and do we bring that home when we think about the places we care about in Ann Arbor? And in just sharing a few of these ideas from away to bringing how we brought it home, I will just go over a couple of ideas. And one was the Pisa. Well, when we were there, in 1989, we were able to climb the tower. They hadn't even shored it up yet. And the cool thing about it was it did immediately remind us of Burton Tower, just physically, as well as the presence of something that sort of looks like Hill Auditorium in front of it. And when we climbed up to the top, we could look down and we could see the mall. And that seemed to feel a similar function, at least in our mind, so that we carried that memory with us back to Ann Arbor. And our kids were very much influenced by this whole experience. You can see the railing system is not all that secure, but I assume they have improved it today, because there was all that
I
work.
was plastered against the wall because I'm afraid of heights. But there's my son out there right at the edge of the leaning tower.
Both our kids were leaning on the railing, like letting me take their picture. But what struck me was the view, which is a mall experience, and the physical place, that sense of place, sticks in your mind. So traveling in general is good because you do build these memories. So seeing it in Ann Arbor, you appreciate the placement of both of these buildings designed by Albert Kahn. You got the tall building and the lower building composition. And then you've also got this sense of the mall and how none of these other buildings are actually Kahn buildings, but the mall itself has taken on so much importance, and it's used universally by people in the community, art fair, and of course the university, especially during COVID. They had all kinds of outdoor classes set up out there. Activities bring people together. You meet your friends, your neighbors. You can sit quietly. You can observe all kinds of creativity. It's a fabulous experience. One of the other places we have been struck by in our travels is this place in Milan, this Galleria, which is famous. And the Galleria has this enclosure, but also the arcade of entry. And so what does that remind you of? Does anybody want to venture the guess? What is that? Yeah.
Eileen been studying Italian. I want her to give you the name of it because of the way she
Galleria
pronounces it.
Vittorio Emanuele II.
There you go. I appreciate that.
Anyway, so obviously I'm sure some of you were thinking Nichols Arcade. And Nichols Arcade is a very special place to so many of us. It has this wall, it's a front, but it invites you inside. It's a cut through, it's got shopping, it's got places for festivals. This is actually the jazz band from Community High celebrating one of our downtown historic markers installations, and it continues to be important to us. Now, this site of the Frieze Building did not have a precedent strongly in mind, but it does talk about why we care about a place. There's so many people, I did not grow up here, so I did not go to school here, but a lot of people still, does anybody go to high school there, the University High, when it was University High? It was a University High School before they had University High. Then it was bought by the university, and it was the Frieze Building, and so a lot of people have strong memories of their underclassmen years and courses there. We thought it had a lot of merit to be saved, but if it can't be saved because you're fighting, City Hall or the government, the university, You can look for things that are special about it and think about how they can get incorporated into a new creation. And the important thing to convince the university of as a community group outside was that this location was a gateway to the northern end of campus. They had not visualized that in the initial design. And as a well-organized community response, we presented very methodically how this location was very important as a gateway and as a place to draw people in. Now, living in this area, it's great because we can walk through here. It's really a shortcut to Hill Auditorium, but the components that got saved are kind of their own story. The Carnegie Library was gone well before, I mean, even when it was the Frieze building had already been destroyed, but that facade still had a lot of attachment to people. And it was sliced off and everything else demolished. And then a couple of components from the Frieze building were saved and installed on the new building. But the important thing was that this gateway function was about an urban place. It wasn't just about the architecture. And it is really a peaceful, if you think it's crazy and all the noise of the construction on State Street and the intersection, step inside the courtyard. It's quiet. You can sit at the tables and have a lunch. You can walk through, like we do. We walk through there all the time. And then it's adjacent to one of the prettiest parks in the city. And I remember saying that one time to Eleanor Pollock, whose husband was Peter Pollock, and it was one of the parks that he was most proud of designing for the university. And it's really compatible as an entry design to get you into Central Campus.
All right, so we're going to go on to the third district. We looked at the river, we looked at Carytown, we took a little side trip over to the campus to look at some buildings there. And now we're going to come back to the downtown area because this is a real key for us and maybe one of the most difficult districts of all to deal with because there's very little that's been moved forward in this and there's filled with all kinds of problems. But we want to have a viable town center. People say, well, you have the campus, you can go to campus, but we don't have families that take their kids over to campus to celebrate, or we don't go over there to have a cup of coffee. That's for students. We need to have our own place. In fact, planners use the term third place. Your first place is where you live, your second place is where you work, and your third place is where you hang out with your community. And one of the things about Ann Arbor is we have places we can hang out, but we always have to pay for the privilege at some restaurant. We can go and sit on the street and have a cup of coffee, but we have to pay for the privilege. There's no place that's public space where we feel we can do that. And so we're going to look at some of the notions of that. And I want to pick up on this article written by one of our famous reporters, Ryan Stanton. I think it was a wonderful article because he talked about the 30 development projects that are happening in Ann Arbor have just happened or are coming up. 30 projects. And out of the 30 projects, every one of them is a housing project. There's no sense of anything else that brings a heart to the city. We're becoming a housing community. And so as all these housing developments go up, and I'm not opposed to having more housing, especially affordable housing in Ann Arbor, this is not any kind of take on that. But it means that we're becoming a bedroom community, not for Detroit, we're becoming a bedroom community for the university. We're building housing because the university is expanding. And we're becoming just a bedroom community for the university without our own heart as a city. We really feel that that needs to be done. So as we look at other cities around the world, and we'll go back to our international perspective, well, first of all, we see the Sagrada Familia, this wonderful basilica in the middle of Barcelona, which has been worked on now for over 100 years, I think, but they're finally getting done next year with it. And it is becoming a true center of not only Barcelona, but it's one of the great sites of the world. It's a marvelous place. We went there and just hung out for a whole day, just looking, just walking around.
We walked there from one of the more commercial parts of town. So you walk there. When you walk there, you pass through residential areas and small local businesses, and then you come upon it. So very much like this is showing you, it is really a place of discovery. And when you see it, it's just overwhelming.
So if we go back to the Venice idea, where we have a cathedral, but it has the forecourt, it has the public space, the open space in front of it. We also have the park space in front of the Sagrada Familia, which makes it work. One of the more current examples was designed by one of the contemporary planners in Seaside, Florida. If you've been there, you might appreciate this, but it was designed to be this kind of wholeness place. And if we look at downtown Seaside, you will see the commercial buildings surround a green space, which relates to the Gulf of Mexico. And there's the same kind of relationships that we have been looking at in other places are so fully developed at Seaside. It's a wonderful example for us. Those are two kind of distant examples. Let's look more closely to home, because if we go to Plymouth, Michigan, we will see they have Kellogg Park right in the middle of the city, and it's surrounded by all the activities that you would want. Kellogg Park has a fountain, lots of seating areas, beautiful green space. It has the historic theater, it has a marketplace across the street, it has the gazebos where they have bands and activities, and it's busy all the time, and it is a very public space. It also, half a block away, has a state-of-the-art library, which I think brings a lot of vitality to it as well. Royal Oak, if you haven't been there, it has a brand new downtown park, Centennial Commons, which is filled with all kinds of activity, very well designed, and has become the center of Royal Oaks community. We're looking at these things. In fact, one other example, Dexter, the town center of Dexter, this little town very near us, has a sense of being someplace special when you're in the middle of Dexter. All these towns have had it. Why doesn't Ann Arbor have this place? Why don't we? It's interesting as we look at it historically.
Yeah, here's a story. Whenever we go swimming at this lake, it's West Pickerel Lake. We love to go swimming at Pickerel Lake. But our treat after swimming at Pickerel Lake is to stop in Dexter for a Dairy Queen Blizzard Mini and sit in the park. And it's just like this memory is reinforced because the lake is wonderful. The Dairy Queen is Dairy Queen, but there's a place to go and sit and watch families gathering and coming and going. It's just how you build these memories is based on what you do with them. You have to have your eyes open to the opportunities.
So why doesn't Ann Arbor have this? It used to. The county courthouse was built on, as we know, on Huron and Main Street, and it had large grassy areas around it. And this is where you'd have the festivals and the special events. And even when we looked at the farmers market, it was our town center. We had a town center back then. But of course, as we see, the new county building built out to the edges, built around the old courthouse so they could tear down the courthouse after they emptied the courthouse into the new building. So it was a very practical solution, but it meant that we lost our town center, and it hasn't been replaced. So we started to look at the history of the downtown to see what we could learn from it. And if we go back to the original town plan from 1836, we will see up in the upper left corner of that plan, we see Courthouse Square. But interestingly, there was another square in that original plan that was called Jail Square, and that is at the corner of 5th and Liberty. That is the location now where we have the federal building, which is where you might go to the post office, but it's a highly secure site. Almost none of us go in there ever. And it puts you off. It has a little bit of a green space in front, but hardly worthwhile. And it is a dead zone. So if we feel that we want to have a town center, maybe this becomes the core of it. In fact, City Council passed a resolution saying, maybe we should look at seeing if we could purchase that federal building site and do something with it other than having a dead space for a federal building. We've been trying to talk to federal building about something like that. So let's get downtown and see some of the activities in the downtown.
So some of our favorite activities in downtown Ann Arbor is the annual Jaycees 4th of July parade. If we're in town, we go. We usually try to get a table we used to go to the Cloverleaf, but we go at Afternoon Delight, 9:30, because if you get there at 9:30, you can stay and sit there to watch the parade. And that's Norm at in front of the Cloverleaf when it was still there. I understand they're not doing it on Liberty Street today because of the construction. I hope it comes back. It was such a delight to see all the bikes decorated, the kids involved, and the politicians throwing candy. It was just a great place to come and see people. The Sonic Lunch has a dedicated audience of its own, and it's always full and crowded. And that's using Liberty Plaza a little bit more intensely than an everyday casual use, which has been problematic, but that's a very popular event. And then the Kemp House is a smaller, quieter venue for historic lectures and afternoon teas. But it's a very important historic building right in that area. Michigan Theater anchors an entertainment district. It's a district that, because of the theaters, multiple theaters, it adds value and business to the downtown. This is something we've been studying and have spoken on with Russ Collins 20 years ago about how the multiple businesses that benefit from having more than one theater in the downtown. So I asked the question, what are the elements of the Michigan Theater that make memories for you? We've actually attended 2 weddings, at least 2 weddings in there, and I'm always doing a double take if somebody is singing in the alley, and I sometimes will go in just to look at the mural, the painting, the graffiti, if you will. But I think there are things that might be special to you. The smell of the popcorn, oh my goodness, it's the best popcorn in the city if you're gonna buy popcorn. Sometimes I'll go in just to get popcorn and keep walking. The art fairs, of course, and they're all over town. You can love them or hate them, but they are vital. They're a vitality that you can't have if you don't offer the spaces to accommodate them. And the commitment to the bike lanes also has challenges, but it's bringing people downtown in non-motorized vehicles that are not clogging the streets with cars and the need for more parking. So this is something that we like seeing it. There's one that goes right by our house, and we love watching the different vehicles going back and forth downtown. And then lastly, this attempt at a temporary use of the top of the parking structure that may keep reminding people, that hopefully is reminding people that there are better uses of the top of the parking structure. And in the meantime, trying to keep it attractive for people who are coming to the library and walking on Fifth Avenue, going to the bus station. Those are things that are special for us.
So how can we create a more viable downtown with all those activities that are scattered around? How can we create a more viable downtown like we've seen in the other cities? In 1989, there was a study to create a conference center, and it was to be placed next to the Michigan Theater in the parking structure with a hotel across on the other side of Washington Street. Back then, people weren't real excited about it. They said, well, we could always use the university if we wanted to have a conference. We now know that we can't do conferences at the university. The university can, but we need to have our own places for this, and the 2009 downtown plan kind of represented that. So as we looked at the downtown plan, I go back to a study that was done in 1962. I have a copy of it that's been up in our attic for a long time, and I refer to it once in a while. And it had an interesting idea because it recognized on the left that we have 2 downtowns, Main Street and State Street. We all know that. But between those 2 is this nebulous gray area that isn't well defined. But if we look at the 1962 plan on the right, we see that they proposed a plaza at the corner of 5th and Liberty, right in the middle of that gray area. That's where our town center should be. That's the center of our town, and we recognize that as a key spot. And of course, that's where the federal building is. And as we look at it then, if we created a town center at that location, it would be a 5-minute walk to both the shopping areas, to the neighborhoods, to the other side of campus. This is a very walkable site to go to. So if we look then at the wholeness district, we've looked at the wholeness district of the river, of Carytown. The wholeness district of the downtown is very unplanned. It is just not happening yet, and we need to address that. The city is now doing a comprehensive plan, but it's not going to deal with this area in the comprehensive plan. But we need to address this whole notion of how can we bring all those activities into a place that can be a true third place for us as a community. One more thing I want to present as an idea, which I think is one of the more popular ideas as I talk to other people. We'll go to Rome and once again and see it in its ancient form. And as the Pope started to develop the Rome later, he used the gateway of Rome. The picture on the right shows the gateway that enters the city. And they had 3 primary spots in Rome that they wanted the people to go to. And so they created 3 avenues, what I would call civic corridors, and they wanted to separate them by building 2 churches, identical churches on either side, so it became very clear that you are now entering the city. There's a big piazza, there's an obelisk there that in the middle of this plaza, and 3 avenues that go off from it. And If we look at the city, then that Piazza de Popolo has different locations that you want to go to on those 3 avenues. One is the Spanish Steps. If you've been to Rome, you certainly understand the significance of that.
We're going in the fall.
Another is the old Palatine Hill and the Roman Forum, and then the one to the right takes you to the river in St. Peter's and all of the development there. So it's an approach, it's a very good example of the importance of having corridors. The other great example, of course, of Washington, D.C., where Pennsylvania Avenue connects Capitol Building to the White House and has been used as a primary corridor. Does Ann Arbor have a primary corridor? We're arguing yes, it should have. It's Fifth Avenue, because Fifth Avenue is the one that can combine a town center to Carytown, goes by City Hall, goes by the Hands-On Museum, goes up to the park, goes up to Broadway West, goes to the train station, goes to the Cascades. This should be a very special place for us. We should convert this Fifth Avenue from a one-way street into something that we're very comfortable with as what we can refer to as a complete street, maybe even call it Bicentennial Boulevard and celebrate our bicentennial in this way. And if you look at these, look at that picture on the upper left. That's a picture I took in Amsterdam. People are walking on the street, there's cars on the street, there's bikes on the street, there's trolleys on the street, and there's no signs telling people what to do. They know what to do. If a street is designed properly, people know what to do on it. So we need to take that approach to Fifth Avenue to create what I would refer to as a civic corridor that connects Ann Arbor together from its downtown to its river. And that's where we are. And here we see that beginning in Carytown area, and we feel that that's been successful. We just need to expand that scope and make it a true civic corridor.
So in conclusion, we return to Christopher Alexander's statement so you can rethink about how he says it. The venerable cities of the past convey a feeling of wholeness and organic unity that surfaces in every detail, large and small. But this sense of wholeness is lacking in modern urban design, indeed with architects absorbed in problems of individual structures and city planners preoccupied with local ordinances. It is almost impossible to achieve. But we ask, can we do it? What can we do together to rebuild and to make these spaces convey a feeling of wholeness? And let's continue the discussion. Hopefully you have some favorite places that you might ask about, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. Thank you. Okay. So we should turn.
Thank you very much. The first question that we have is please talk about the library lot, center of the city project.
I should probably talk about that because I was part of a group that was established by the city about 3 years ago to try to do something with the library lot, the parking structure, and to create a civic center there, a city center. And it's too small to be a town center. And so it was a little frustrating trying to work because we could only work with city-owned properties, which meant the parking structure and half of Liberty Plaza, because half of Liberty Plaza is owned by First Martin. So the city only owns half of Liberty Plaza and the parking structure. We can't create a town center from that basis. And so we realized that that was kind of an exercise that was not going anywhere, and we had to rethink things in this more wholeness approach. We have to deal with that 2-block area as a whole entity rather than just 2 small sites.
All right, I'm going to ask a question. Is the city planning office of Ann Arbor receptive to some of these ideas? Or are they blocked by the fact that so many buildings are owned privately?
I'm going to give a general planning answer to that because city planning, many people in the city are aware of the need for taking a more whole approach, but it's difficult to do because it's all privately owned property. I feel the approach is that we have to take a public-private partnership approach and not rely, people first say, well, the city can't afford to make a town center. No, the city can't afford to make a town center. What it does is it provides incentives and plans and regulations and things to put it in place so you attract private investment to have a town center. So I think that if you have a very strong plan that shows what the town center could be, Then the private investors, there are a lot of private investors, I've talked to any number of them, who would love to spend tens of millions of dollars in that 2-block area, maybe $100 million in that 2-block area, if there was a reason to. But as long as the federal building is there and it's a dead zone and there's only a parking structure to work with and the library doesn't know what it's doing yet, they're not going to invest any money. So you have to have some kind of an arrangement where people know what the future of that 2-block area is going to be. Then people will be able to start moving forward, both the public and the private sector together.
You mentioned the federal building. What would it take to move that someplace else? I mean,
He is the person to ask, because he has been working on this,
who owns the land?
well, the federal government.
The General Services Administration owns it. And,
Oh, the land.
I don't really want to talk about it very much because we have had conversations in a lot of ways with a lot of people about this very concept of a town center, and we're not ready to talk about it in great detail yet. So I'd rather not answer that question, although I could provide a lot of detail to it. Maybe in the near future we would be able to discuss it in more detail.
We do know that it would be a very long-term process to be able to implement something like that, but it isn't something we're unaware of or that people are not largely aware of as a possibility, but it's going to be very hard to move off that stationary point.
We have a group that is looking at that. It's a private group. It has nothing to do with the city. It's like our talk. Our talk is all about our ideas. The ideas for what to do with that 2-block area are all kind of personal ideas, but we've been talking to a lot of people about it. And Eileen is involved with a Greens Committee that is trying to bring something to the parking structure itself, putting some planting on there, and they've been doing a good job. They have some money to do a mural. More power to them, but that won't be a town center. It will be a better parking structure, but it won't be a town center. So I think there are two different questions.
I think there's some questions down
Yep.
here. Or Bob, do you have one?
He's not paying, oh, he's got some already. Gotta give it to him.
Yes, I do have one. Can you comment on the Greenway and its place in connecting the community?
Want me to answer that?
Well, I mean, Norm has more awareness of that, but the green, we didn't focus on that because it goes around the periphery of this area that we focused on along the Fifth Avenue corridor. Certainly, the Greenway, where it connects to the river, at the river location, we hope that can continue to get improvement, but that's separate from the focus that we had on the more central three elements of the wholeness concept in downtown.
There are different ways to answer that too, because we have the Green Belt, and maybe you're referring to the Green Belt program, which is buying property out in the county to establish it as a continuing green area. What we realized when we were doing some looking at it is a third of that money that's developed for the Greenbelt area comes into the city. So the city actually has a good amount of money from the Greenbelt program to do parks in the city. They aren't really interested because when you buy more parks, then you have to have more maintenance, and they don't have staff they can't maintain the parks they have. So it's a kind of an interesting situation there. The other thing is there is the trail that has been planned to go around town with on the old Allen Creek, and that's a different kind of a project that has been partially now funded and begun. So there are different kinds of aspects to it that we didn't go into in our report, our presentation. Yeah.
Bob, do you have another question?
Can you discuss the status of Grand Rapids in Kalamazoo from the perspective of urban planning?
Well, Grand Rapids, he's asking if we should discuss Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo. They're different, yeah. Grand Rapids has a river, and there are river walks, and they're very well established, and they're established on both sides of the river that feed into the neighborhood. It's a very linear north-south experience, so it's already part of the downtown. The challenge we have in Ann Arbor is that the river is not part of the downtown, so it's an element on the northern edge of the downtown. And Kalamazoo, they covered it up. They covered up the river, and now they're trying to reopen it. But I haven't been to Kalamazoo in a few years, so I don't know if it...
Let me answer that question another way too, because I hate to talk too politically, but I feel I have to give an answer to this question. The difference in Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids is they've empowered their planning department to be able to make decisions to move forward. Ann Arbor has not empowered its planning department to make these kind of decisions, and they've retained that power largely with council, who isn't really interested in doing this kind of planning. So I think I know the planners in Kalamazoo, I know the planner in Grand Rapids, and they have this vision of a town that they have worked toward for many years. And if you've been to Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids, you can see the results of it. That hasn't happened in Ann Arbor because we haven't empowered, the city hasn't empowered to have that kind of a plan. And I don't think the comprehensive plan will do that because that's largely neighborhood oriented. It's not oriented toward the downtown.
30 years ago, there was the planning for Ann Arbor. I was on the planning commission in the heyday of Martin Overheiser. It was a fabulous experience, what an education. And what they did then was like every other year, they would tackle another part of town. I think there were 7, and one of them was the central area plan. And I think that was in 1991 or 2 when that final version was published. And you know what happened? About 10, 15 years ago, they decided they were still willing to revisit the central area plan. And basically all they did was reformat what we had completed 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And it's like, that's the creativity of the planning department today. They're not empowered to look at what are the issues and how do we bring this all together in a vision, because we used to talk about that when I was on planning commission 35 years ago, that we need to have the vision in front of us when we're thinking about the decisions we're making as planners. And I felt like we were making that progress, but when Martin left, it didn't continue.
You have to understand that we're both architects and planners. And
Yeah.
so we feel strongly that
We're
you
very
need to
frustrated.
empower the planners more. I think that's the key to Ann Arbor is, give more ability to do the kinds of things we're thinking of here.
So we have a number of questions here from the audience. I miss shopping on Main Street. Too much dining. Where is the balance? Why is it lacking?
Well, we can't dictate who goes in the buildings as much as an individual owner. The best thing is when an individual building owner says, I will not rent or lease to a restaurant. That's the only thing you can do is a commitment from a building owner. There's nothing that restricts that use. And once a restaurant goes in, it's very hard to convert back. So a number of buildings that have been undergoing this sort of change are like Crazy Wisdom, where it did close for a little while, but it's going to reopen. They always had a little bit of a coffee shop, restaurant, food offered on the second floor. They're not going to do that. And Peaceable Kingdom, where it was a hiatus of activity, and they're going to try to come back without a major restaurant. It's challenging because those businesses don't draw the retail traffic to justify the high rents. And many of the businesses have been forced out by high rents, and so you end up with the national chain who could subsidize what their rental cost is in the downtown.
Let me expand on that one a little bit. Am I still on?
You're on? Yeah, you were only facing me, so you didn't think you heard it.
You can hear me on the, okay, good.
Well, we need you on the mic for the Zoom people.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering whether I lost the mic or not.
You go stand in front of the other one.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Maybe the thing came out. Well,
This one talk?
Let's see.
want to use mine? Yeah, it should be on.
Oh, where's it?
It's, this one may have died.
Oh, yeah, this one's supposed to be on.
Testing.
Okay, here we go. Thank you.
Technology.
We got it.
Mine's still working.
The other part of it is going back to this notion of public-private partnerships. And the idea is that how can you get the private sector to do what you want it to do for the public sector? The private sector is all about making money. There's no doubt about it. The bottom line is what controls what private sector does. And if you look at Ann Arbor now, we're getting a lot of, thank you, we're getting a lot of student housing, one student housing project after another, because it's the most profitable thing you can do in the United States right now is build student housing. You load up with students who are willing to pay fabulous prices for a little bedroom with a TV and a small bathroom and no living room, very little kitchen area, and they're paying enormous prices for that. As a result, we're getting a lot of student housing because Right behind the library, there's another one going up, right behind the library downtown. Another student housing project because it's much more profitable than building condos and certainly a lot more profitable than building stores. And so we're getting a result of what is the dynamics of it financially. So if we want to have the things that the question is asked, how can we get the kind of town we want? We have to have the city give the kind of incentives where the bottom line for a developer gives you what you want rather than what they want. And so you have to have a city that understands that policies and programs have to be in place to get the private development to do what you want them to do. And the best example is, that I know of, is the planning in Canada. Because in Canada, the planning department...
Vancouver specifically.
We're very familiar with Vancouver. In Canada, the planning director, the planning department is empowered to say, there should be a 10-story apartment building on this site. Who wants to build it? And so it isn't the developer deciding that they want to build a building. It's the city deciding they want to build a building. Who wants to build it? You can make a profit with it, but this is what we want where. That's an approach that we can't do in the United States because of the property rights problems. But the closer we get to that, the better we'll get to an answer to your question, I think.
Okay. This is on a different tact. Could you share the background of your house if we promise not to knock on your front door?
You can take that one.
We moved to Ann Arbor in 1983 and lived on the west side. It was a great place to have our kids grow up. And when they left, we said, well, now what? And our neighbor on Division, Ray Detter, was working with us on the Downtown Street Exhibits program, and he said, you know, Charlotte's going to sell her house. Why don't you and Eileen buy it? He said it to Norm. And we said, well, okay. And we didn't give it any more thought than that. It was a little challenging, but so we've been there 20...
You better describe what the house is.
I know, 20 years. In that time, there is a book out there that we wrote on our journey of trying to understand why the house was built the way it was. And because we couldn't find a lot of historical documents about who lived there, we know who lived there, but a lot of the detail had not been published about why they built in that style. So what we did was to undertake our own research, and what we loved finding was that the style of Greek revival was popular in this country from 1820 to just before the Civil War, when plantation buildings made it unpopular, so the columns were associated with that. So it's really considered a high-style Greek revival based on evidence that we tracked down in Greece. So the front is a very pure expression of Greek revival. The columns are wood, like staves of a barrel. It's hollow inside. And the walls are incredible. They're solid masonry, like this thick, and so they are their own temperature control.
What she hasn't described to you is where the house is. We live in a Greek revival house on the corner of Ann and Division, right downtown. It's a white house with the 4 columns that most of you are probably familiar with. It's considered to be one of the most historic Greek revival houses in the country. It's a very significant house, and we've got 24 books that have information about our house in them, and I think that's the reason for the question.
Maybe.
We didn't talk about our house today. We love to talk about our house, but it wasn't part of the presentation.
And it's just something that we feel so lucky and fortunate that we've been able to occupy it like we have for 20 years. And we do share it quite a bit with the public. We don't like too many people knocking on the door unplanned, but like the historic district.
But they do.
Yeah, occasionally. And sometimes we find that they're distant descendants of people who owned it or lived there. Even students who rented occasionally from the War family. But the Historic District Commission it has an annual awards program, and we host the reception afterwards. And it's always a treat because people will walk from City Hall up Ann Street, and then they come in the front door.
One more piece of information about the house. It was built in the 1830s and 40s, so it's one of the oldest houses in town. We're the 4th owners of it.
It's hard to
So it was built by Judge Wilson. For most of the 19th century, it was owned by the Wells family. For most of the 20th century, it was owned by the War family, the War-Soliday family, and now we're the 21st century owners of it. So I don't think we'll own it for 100 years, but I'd love to.
And our kids are not moving back, so let us know if you know. Yeah,
All right, next question.
I don't know what else to answer. It's just lovely to live there, I have to say.
What are your thoughts about the tree line trail. Do we need it? And Fifth Avenue as a civic corridor? I think you sort of talked some about that.
Civic corridor, yeah. Well, go ahead. I mean,
That's the tree line trail.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the tree line. We didn't show a map of it, but it's something that follows the Allen Trail and kind of goes around the city and crosses the river and makes a big loop around the city eventually. That's the purpose of it, to have this trail. It doesn't have anything to do with our suggestion of using Fifth Avenue as a civic corridor down the middle of the city. This is meant to be a pathway that goes around the city that connects different aspects of it together. So I think they're very different things. I'm very supportive of the idea. In fact, it was largely instituted by Joe O'Neill, who we showed you today. That's his project, and he's very proud of it.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a long question, two parts. One is, what's the population of Ann Arbor? And why can't this person get the street sign on their street correct? It should be Drive instead of Avenue.
We should refer to those things to other sources.
Yeah.
And you would suggest,
Yeah.
how do they contact at the city?
I use A2Fix-It a lot, and it's an app on your phone, and you can report things any number of ways. You can record who you are or not. I use it a lot to report like a dead tree or a down branch or an abandoned bicycle. If the street sign is an issue, I would report it there and don't let them forget it. And if they respond saying, well, we'll hand it off to somebody else, you can call this person, well, then you know who to call. So, because we've had an issue with the tree dying in front of our house because when they built the bike lane, they covered up the base of the tree this high and it's just dying. But I can't get anybody to come and fix that because the dirt is so compacted, we can't do it. So you can try, but people do not answer the phone at City Hall. You have to go through some kind of email or reporting system and hopefully be persistent enough to get a real person on the other end. But A2Fix-It does work. They acknowledge, they read it, they hand it on to somebody. Well, I questioned another property. I reported it because I thought work was taking place at a building that didn't have a permit posted, a building permit. Well, it turns out a year ago, the city instituted a whole new permitting system, and I didn't know about it. So instead of E-Track-It, they now use something called Stream. And yeah, it's true, the contractor didn't post the permit, but he in fact did have one, and I was glad to see it. But you can use and I got a response. And so yes, A2Fix-It has been useful.
We're kind of getting away from our topic here a little bit.
But it's living downtown. I mean, like, I don't know the tree line and the Beltway, all those issues as intimately as I do about how to cross division where there isn't a crosswalk, or where, even if there is a crosswalk, the safety measures you begin to adopt in a different mindset. I mean, some of you have lived in big cities. I know Carol was living in New York. I know a lot of people have lived in I lived in big cities in the past. But so you learn how to be safe. We have 2 cats. We take them out on harnesses, separate harnesses. We walk our cats in our yard. We don't take them beyond, but you have to learn what is safe. What is safe? What makes you feel safe?
I think that the main point is that we live downtown, and so we have to deal with the issues of downtown, and we're happy to do that. There's a real benefit to living where we live. We love because we can walk to Carytown, to Hill Auditorium, to downtown. We can walk everywhere. We went for weeks without using our car. We can do that. But there are trade-offs.
Someone asked a question. Do you have any thoughts about redevelopment and design of the South State Street entry point to the city near Briarwood?
You don't do that. I don't know if that person means the new transportation corridor zoning, or if it's just in general a question about entry.
Well, asking about any redevelopment and
Okay, she's now
design.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I'm not sure where transportation corridor zoning is going to work optimally as hoped for, because the actual restrictions are not obvious. You know, they can zone a whole area and say, oh, transportation corridor, but when you get down to the individual parcel, the setbacks and other constraints on the property do actually provide some limitation. I do think it's enough of a hub of activity that more intense development can occur, but it's hard to visualize it as an attractive entry to the city. And if you're coming up State Street, where do you feel? I mean, it is pretty, it doesn't have a good sense of arrival. So if there's something we can do, Eisenhower and State seem to provide a better entry than the highway, but there's a whole lot of activity that's happening all the way down to Ellsworth. So I don't know how much the city is going to institute that will encourage quality arrival points. Like, well, so the university, I talked about North Quad being an entry point for the north end of campus. And that was after the buildings had been designed for the new Ford Policy Center, which is, they touted as a southern entry point to campus. So that and the law school, so that, I'm not trusting them to not go farther south, however, but the architect that designed that building was then invited to do the new design for North Quad because they saw the value of having a bookend. Now, that was something the university could do. The city has less control over what happens within its borders, and certainly less
We have to
beyond.
understand too, the university owns its own property, it can do whatever it wants with the property. The city doesn't have that advantage. The city has to work with other property owners and doing, it's a lot more difficult. So we don't want to be too critical of the city because they're in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, yeah, and we feel encroached upon because the historic districts are not sacrosanct either. We've certainly had the university encroach on north of Huron and west of Glen, which are sites that are actively being under construction now, and historic buildings were torn down to do that. They were in the historic district, but once the university buys those properties, doesn't matter. So it's an ongoing discussion. I will say, to their credit, they have been willing to meet with a small group of us to let us know what's coming. We're not going to change anybody's mind, but they have given us access to literally document buildings that are going to be torn down. So all those buildings that were torn down for the pharmacy building, school, we were in there, and that was right at the beginning of COVID. And I remember feeling, just so paranoid about everything. But we surveyed, Susan Weinberg and I surveyed all three of those buildings. We've also surveyed the most sad building that we're going to lose is the Pound House Ginsburg Center. It's just sad to my mind. That's had me. So we
were asked to do a talk on historic preservation, and we could. I mean, we've done a lot of them, and preservation is a very important part of what makes Ann Arbor work. And we would really want to protect our historic heritage, even in the African American neighborhood, as we talked about in Carytown. That's important to us. But we also felt like what we talked about today was just as important. Not dealing with just buildings, but dealing with spaces and the relationship of spaces and how they work together and developing wholeness. Because when you save an individual building, that's a partial success, but it has to be within a context of something much larger. That's why we took this.
And so when is the tipping point when you lose certain elements that created an interesting place? Here's another one. Cornwell Place, which is where the nursing school is. So Cornwell Place used to have a collection of really interesting historic buildings that were part of the old Fourth Ward. Well, gradually the university has bought them up. They put in the new nursing school, and they're going to tear down the last two buildings that are on Cornwell Place. So it's like, when do you say, well, okay, that one's gone? I think a lot of us have felt, well, those are gone. But when they start to encroach south of Hill Street, then I start to feel more paranoid about the encroachment. And South Forest.
You'll see that in our presentation today, we didn't deal very much with the university. We gave you three examples, but we didn't deal with the university because we felt that's a whole different problem. We wanted to deal with the city today.
Yeah.
And so we stayed focused on the city from the river to the downtown. And when you get into the university, it's a whole different discussion. You talk to different people, you have different kinds of dynamics happen, and that's a different kind of problem to try to resolve.
I will say that if you love Ann Arbor, you want to be engaged. You don't say, well, it's awful, I'm just going to complain. I walk away from those discussions. I literally do. I had one yesterday, and a person was sitting next to me and started talking about, why do they let this happen? I just got up and walked away. I don't engage in that. I just don't, I'm happy to sort of say I don't like certain things the university or the developers are doing, but at the same time, I feel like the responsibility is to be engaged, to ask questions. If there's an opportunity that you can write a letter of concern or support, then do that. And I've done that for people who have reached out and asked, well, Eleanor Lynn, who lives in the South Forest area, she's very concerned about these new developments on South Forest. And I can't remember the dates of when that's going to Planning Commission. Oh, I forgot.
Okay,
I'm
take
so,
your time, Lou.
yeah, it's 4 seconds, 3, 2, 1. So
Okay.
we're going to be here if anyone wants to approach us. So
I was going to say, we've reached the end of our question and answer period. It sounds like our speakers may be available for a little more discussion out in the open area. But thank you very much for this wonderful presentation.
I will mention too, on the table out in the lobby are books, and we'd be glad to talk about some of the books that we've written on different
yeah,
topics.
and if we can be an advocate for anybody who's working on an issue, we're happy to write those letters of support because we still care. We're not moving.
Thanks so much for coming.